On Easter mornings in North Carolina, that's where I'm originally from, the grass wakes before the sun does. It keeps the night cupped in its palms a little longer than the sky. Dew sort of beads along each blade, trembling. Nut gets surrendered to light. The whole lawn glazed in that fragile sheen that makes even an ordinary yard look sacramental. I used to run barefoot into it, past the emerald siding of my house, past the brick porch still cool from the dark, past the tall oak door with its circular window like a single unblinking eye, and I would feel the wetness climb my ankles, as if the earth itself were baptizing me back into itself. But before that running, there was the waiting. The house still dim, the clock reading something impossibly early, the kind of early that makes your stomach hurt softly, not from hunger, but the shock of waking before your body has agreed to it. You stand on a hardwood floor in fleece pajamas, the fabric slightly too warm for the day will become, and you pad toward the front door where the small circular window holds the first rumor of morning. The sky is not yet blue. It's bruised in purples and diluted oranges, a watercolor wash spreading slowly over the horizon. A single bird tries out its voice, then another answers. The world is testing its sound again. Somewhere far off, a dog barks once and then thinks better of it. The air feels charged, not necessarily with noise, but with promise. You press your breath against the glass and fog the pain. Blooms outward in a white cloud, your own small weather system, then fades. You do it again. Your siblings line up beside you, shoulders bumping, whispering, negotiating who'll run first when the door opens. You're all a little cold, a little tired, electric with anticipation. The porch outside is still, holding the chill of the night, the brick faintly damp, the railing beaded with dew. There's something shockingly refreshing about that air when the door finally swings open. It slips into your lungs like a surprise. It smells like cut grass and wet earth and the faint sweetness of the Bradford pear tree just beginning to bloom. You step out and the dew soaks instantly through the cuffs of your pajamas, darkening the fleece. It's uncomfortable and exhilarating at once. The wetness makes you gasp and laugh at the same time. And behind you, your parents stand in the doorway, half awake and fully loving. They watch you with that quiet, patient joy that says this moment is as much theirs as it is yours. Their love is the warm light inside the house, while the yard still belongs to Don. You know, even as a child, that this will end. The Easter eggs will be found, the basket will fill, the sweetness will be tasted and gone. There's already a faint ache braided into the excitement, knowledge that joy is fleeting, and that its very fleetingness is what makes it glow. You feel it without naming it. This is good because it will not last. The front lawn was never uniform. Tall fescue stood upright and composed through mild winters, cool season witness. Zoysia crept in low and dense, patient, lateral, turning the color of straw when frost lingered, but returning thick and warm with heat. They overlapped without consultation. They shared a yard without surrendering their distinct growth. Underfoot, you could feel the difference. One springier, one tighter, one slicker with dew. The law did not erase its plurality. It held it. The jelly beans would go soggy in the grass. You would reach down, your clothes darkening at the knees, your palm smelling like chlorophyll and soil, and lift candy whose color had begun to blur, sweetness altered by moisture. You had to decide whether you would still taste it. The Bradford pear again in the front yard bloomed in reckless white, petals falling like polite snowfall against green. Beneath it, a low brick stepping wall curved around the roots, a boundary that meant to protect but never fully contained. In the backyard, a stone recess wall held the slope in place, flower beds lining its base in seasonal procession, azaleas wrapping in pink, impatiens softening the shade, marigolds burning stubborn orange through summer heat, hydrangeas shifting blue or purple depending on the soil's hidden chemistry, as if the earth itself refused singularity. The grass was always wet on Easter, and still we ran into it. Jeremiah says, "Come, let us contrive a plot against him. Let us carefully note his every word." I hear that and I think of how quickly communities can reassure themselves that removing one voice will not mean the loss of instruction from the priests, nor counsel from the wise, nor prophecy from the prophets. As if the body can lose a limb and still call itself whole. As if the absence of LGBTQIA plus people from pews and pulpits would not mean the absence of something irreplaceable. Let us destroy him by his own tongue. How many of us have felt that careful noting? How many of us have sensed that every sentence we utter might be archived as evidence against our belonging? That if we speak too clearly about our love, our bodies, our lives, the very articulation of truth will be turned into the pit dug for us. And Jeremiah's grief is not only that he is misunderstood, but that goodness itself has been inverted. Must good be repaid with evil, he cries, that they should dig a pit to take my life. He stood before God to speak on their behalf, to turn away wrath from them, and still they contrived against him. This is not merely the sadness of being disliked, it is the theological horror of a community that punishes intercession, that receives advocacy as threat. There is something intimately recognizable here for queer Catholics who have loved the church with real fidelity, who have prayed for her, served her, defended her, sung her hymns, studied her saints, only to be treated as if our presence is a problem to be managed rather than a gift to be received. Must love be repaid with suspicion? Must devotion be repaid with scrutiny? The prophet's question is not self-pity, it is moral clarity. When a community digs pits for those who seek its healing, something in its spiritual vision has curdled. I hear the whispers of the crowd, the psalm says, that frighten me from every side. We know those whispers. We know the tone that says, this is not really about you, it's about doctrine. This is not really exclusion, it's fidelity. This is not really harm, it's clarity. We know what it is to feel plotted against in polite language. And the psalm names the mechanism. You will free me from the snare they set for me. A snare is not a frontal assault, it's subtle, procedural, reputational. It's the meeting where your humanity is discussed without you in the room. It's the document drafted in the language of pastoral care that leaves you nowhere to stand. It's the soft insistence that you may belong, provided you don't speak too loudly about who you are, provided your love remains unspecific, provided your life stays legible to those who have never had to fight for breath. The psalm does not deny the snare and does not romanticize it. It entrusts itself beyond it. Into your hands I commend my spirit, not into the hands of committees, not into the hands of commentators, into the hands of God. In your hands is my destiny. That's not passivity. It's refusal to let the whispering crowd narrate reality. Belonging is not granted by vote. It is bestowed in creation. We have spent too long acting as though our presence in the church is a hypothesis to be defended rather than a fact to be honored. We have internalized the premise that the default position is our disqualification and that we must argue our way upward toward conditional acceptance. That is not humility. That is gaslighting absorbed. We will not audition for the life we want. We will not accept a church in which our first posture must be apology. Our belonging is assumed by virtue of our existence. The image of God is not rationed according to orientation. The soul within the four corners of the body does not flicker in and out depending on who is evaluating it. And because that belonging is given, not earned, we are not obliged to entertain every demand for self-justification as if our humanity were a classroom exercise. There are voices that will ask us to explain ourselves as though we were a theological abstraction, an issue to be debated, a question mark to be resolved, and they will do it with the default posture that we do not deserve to be here until we have persuaded them otherwise. That's spiritual coercion, the slow attempt to make you consent to your own diminishment. We do not owe our lives to that kind of interrogation. We do not owe our breath to the people who insist on treating our existence as a problem. The gospel is not an audition, and neither is the church. Anyone who requires your disappearance as the price of their comfort is not asking you to be holy. They are asking you to be manageable. And I will not spend my life translating God's handiwork into a dialect that flatters the gatekeeper. The soul can shrink. I know this intimately. It can reposition itself within the bodily frame when frightened. It can curl inward under the weight of self-hatred, can build narratives, meek, ambiguous, manageable, in order to survive. I built those narratives. I layered anxiety and smallness over authenticity because I believe safety required invisibility. The scar of that remains. But the soul never left. God was in that interior vastness, even when I refused to look at it directly. The capacity to reason, to imagine, to conceptualize the self across time, to hold memory like dew on grass and see that it glints even as it prepares to fall, is all itself evidence of divine breath. To understand the divine is to look inward first, and then interpersonally, to recognize that every other LGBTQIA person sitting quietly in a pew carries a cosmos inside of them, a history of longing and courage and prayer that cannot be reduced to a paragraph in a catechism. And this is where the work of authenticity becomes holy, because unlearning self-erasure is not instantaneous and it is not neat. When you've lived for years as a silhouette, when you have trained your tongue to soften, your wrists to still, your joy to dim itself before anyone can dim it for you, The return to your own full voice can feel like learning to walk again. Tender, awkward, trembling, beautiful. Sometimes you catch yourself reverting to old scripts. You have to bless yourself through it. Give yourself grace for the way your body remembers what your theology now rejects. The interior life is not just a place where God is found, it is a place where God patiently rehabilitates what the world taught you to amputate. And if we look inward and find God there, we are also compelled to look outward and find God outside, because the divine image is not only etched into my own soul, but into the souls of others, queer and straight, trans and cis, wounded and self-assured, all of us carrying holiness in the quiet architecture of our bodies. The church is meant to be the place where we practice that recognition aloud, where we train our eyes to see God in faces we were taught to fear, where we let other people's belovedness call our own back to life. In a world obsessed with categories, the Christian task is not to police the border of who counts. It is to witness again and again that God has already crossed it. And if we're going to speak plainly about inclusion, we must say what the church often forgets to say out loud. Queer and trans people are not approaching the church from the outside, asking for special permission to become human. We are already here. We are already baptized, already carrying grief and devotion in the same chest, already kneeling with our hands open, already serving as lectors and catechists and choir members and ministers of care, already visiting the sick, already cooking for parish potlucks, already lighting candles for the dead, already believing, sometimes against all evidence, that God still breathes through the stone. Inclusion is not the church lowering a drawbridge for strangers. It is a church recognizing its own members as members, refusing to treat our existence as an ecclesial inconvenience. And we shouldn't be surprised that the gospel keeps returning to this point. The ones made peripheral by the crowd are often the ones closest to the heart of God. The question is never whether we can make ourselves acceptable enough to approach Christ. The question is whether the community around Christ will stop acting like gatekeepers of a mercy that was never theirs to ration. We do not ask to be loved after we become legible. We ask the church to remember what it claims to believe, that grace precedes deserving, that dignity precedes explanation, that God does not wait for perfect language before calling someone beloved. I am the light of the world, Jesus says. Whoever follows me will have the light of life. Light does not erase dew, it reveals it. Light spills slowly over the lawn, turning each bead of moisture into a brief jewel. The sky shifts from violet to apricot to something approaching gold. A breeze moves through the Bradford pear and the petals tremble. The birds grow bolder in their song. Your siblings shout when they spot the first egg. The morning widens. And the light Jesus names is not fragile, not conditional, not stingy. It's not the kind of light that must bleach difference into sameness in order to shine. It does not require that the lawn become one species of grass to be called beautiful. Light dignifies texture. Light exposes injustice. Light makes visible what was hidden and calls it real. When queer Catholics live openly within the church, when we refuse to shrink, refuse to disappear, refuse to translate ourselves into euphemism, that is not darkness intruding upon holiness. It is light clarifying what was always there. The body has always been more varied, more complicated, more alive than its gatekeepers admit. In the gospel, as Jesus goes up to Jerusalem, he does not hide the trajectory. He names it, handed over, condemned, mocked, scourged, crucified. The path of fidelity is not sanitized, nor is it comfortable. And while he walks openly towards suffering, others are still asking about seats of honor, right and left, proximity and prestige, hierarchy and rank. Command that these two sons of mine sit. We still ask that question in different forms. Who sits closest? Who has the authority to define? Who lords it over? Who gets to make their authority felt? You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, Jesus says, and the great ones make their authority over them felt. But it shall not be so among you. It shall not be so among you. This is not sentimental language, but structural instruction. It is Jesus rejecting a model of authority built on hierarchy and fear, rejecting the instinct to preserve power by narrowing belonging. If our ecclesial life replicates domination, if it relies on marginalization to maintain control, then we have misunderstood him. The greatness Jesus describes is measured by who is protected, who is lifted, who is served, whose dignity is treated as non-negotiable. By that metric, queer inclusion is not a political concession. It is a gospel demand. A church that cannot imagine queer people as full agents of grace has lapsed into the very pattern Christ rebukes. And notice where Jesus is standing when he says this. in the middle, in the crossfire. Too disruptive for the Pharisees who wanted purity without mercy, too insufficient for the zealots who wanted revolution without patience. He's a scandal to both sides because he refuses the cheap satisfactions of extremity. He insists on love that is costly, truth that is embodied, holiness that touches lepers and eats with sinners, and answers trap questions with mercy. To live near him is to be pressed from both directions. If you feel that pressure, if you are told you are too faithful to be free and too free to be faithful, you may not be failing. You may be occupying the exact tense, perilous, luminous center where Christ has always stood. If our defense of doctrine requires the humiliation of queer people, it is not service. If our clarity about teaching produces despair in those who love Christ, it is not greatness. Greatness, Jesus insists, looks like service. Whoever wishes to be first must be slave. The Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve. What would it mean for the church to serve LGBTQ Catholics rather than to scrutinize them? To wash their feet instead of carefully noting their words, to ask not how they can be managed, but how their gifts can strengthen the body. And what would it mean for queer Catholics to hear at last that their love is not only tolerated in private, but honored as capable of holiness? That our tenderness, our fidelity, our capacity to see masks and still choose mercy is not a liability, but a charism. The church speaks often of vocation. It speaks often of gifts. It speaks often of the Spirit distributing grace as the Spirit wills. We are asking the church to apply its own theology to our lives, to recognize that the Spirit has not skipped over queer people, that the church has not, that God has not stopped creating in us, that our existence is not an impediment to salvation, but one of the places salvation insists on being born. And let us say it even more plainly, without flinching. Queer love is not counterfeit of the real thing. It is one of the real places where charity learns to take flesh. It is one of the ways human hearts practice covenant. It's not outside the horizon of sanctification. The church knows how to bless bread and wine into body and blood. Surely it can learn to bless the lives of the people who have been feeding its choirs, tending its sick, holding its grief, and still showing up to kneel. If love is the measure of the law, then queer love is not exempt from grace. It is a candidate for it, radiant, difficult, ordinary, holy. Because make no mistake, the body is weaker when it amputates. Grass grows under tension. Fescue and zoysia push against each other, roots weaving through the same soil, drawing from the same water. The law is not threatened by that plurality, but textured by it. Its resilience depends on it. A monoculture may look tidy, but it's fragile. One disease, one drought, and it browns in uniform collapse. The church, too, was never meant to be a monoculture. We who are queer are not weeds in the yard of God. We are not invasive species to be managed. We are part of the original design of a creation that overflows with variation. Hydrangeas shifting color according to hidden chemistry, azaleas flaring pink against green, marigolds stubborn in heat. To exclude us is to deny the Creator's imagination. And this is perhaps why the church's moral imagination has sometimes grown thin, because when you exile a people, you not only wound them, you deprive yourself of the particular radiance they carry. When LGBTQIA plus people are forced into silence, the church loses a vocabulary of tenderness it desperately needs. It loses witnesses who have learned by necessity how to forgive, how to persist, how to love in the presence of fear. It loses prophets trained by survival to tell the truth without spectacle. Inclusion is not merely about our relief. It is about the church's capacity to reflect the fullness of God's own creativity. I used to believe I could brute force my way into acceptance, that if I were articulate enough, pious enough, disciplined enough, I can manufacture a space for myself. I learned instead that life gives some things and withholds others, and that my thrownness into a particular body, a particular orientation, a particular church is not a mistake to be corrected, but a condition to be inhabited. Make do with what you have, not in resignation, but in reverence. When Jesus asks, "Can you drink the chalice that I'm going to drink?" he is not inviting his disciples into prestige, but into participation. The chalice is not a crown, but exposure, vulnerability before structures that misunderstand you. It is the willingness to be seen, to be misread, to be spoken about in whispers, and still to remain in communion. To remain in the church while advocating for one's own dignity is to drink something bitter. It is to accept that fidelity will sometimes be met with mockery, that love will sometimes be met with suspicion, that your very voice may feel dangerous to people who prefer silence. And yet the chalice is not meaningless. It joins our endurance to Christ's own steadfastness and makes our staying not merely stubbornness, but a form of communion with the one who is handed over and still loved. So yes, we stay, not as masochism, not as nostalgia, but as fidelity. We stay because the body is ours too, because baptism is not revocable, because the Eucharist is not a prize for the unscarred, but food for the hungry. We stay because the church belongs to Christ, and Christ belongs to the ones the crowd whispers about. We stay because we refuse to hand the altar to those who mistake control for holiness. We stay because love requires witnesses, and resurrection requires bodies that did not run. Easter grass is always wet. You run into it anyway. You kneel. Your clothes stain. Your hands smell like earth. The dew glints and then disappears. The sun rises fully now, warming the porch, drying the fleece at your ankles, illuminating your parents still standing in the doorway, watching you with that steady love that has always been there. The morning will end. The eggs will be gathered. The baskets will be set aside. The sweetness will fade on your tongue. But what was real will not vanish. It lives in you. And that, like dew catching light for one brief, radiant moment, is holy.